Hi, I'm Jake Warner. I'm Cycle CEO and founder. Welcome to the, I think, sixth or seventh version of our podcast. Today we have David Dymko and Walt Ribeiro from Vulture joining us. Welcome, guys.
Yep. Thanks for having
And
us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This is great.
yeah, no, I'm super excited. And for everyone who might be new to Cycle or learning about us for the first time, so we've been working with Vulture for almost like 2.5 years now as a partner. And we've been supporting Vulture's virtual machines since I think like late 2018. And so as we've been doing this podcast series, we've been really eager to be able to get the Vulture team involved as part of this, and we have some announcements coming out, and we can dive into those as we go through this podcast. But really excited to have the Vulture team here. And so I guess diving right in, so I think first would be I think our audience would love to hear about what you guys do at Vulture. What does the day to day look like, and just starting with that.
Yeah, okay, so I'll start. So Vulture has 17 locations and they're growing, and we think that Cycle is a great partner just to run containers easily on top of the Vulture infrastructure. So, in terms of what we do and what our day today is like, right now we're expanding globally. Well, we're already located in 17 locations globally, but we're expanding, every few months. We're continually adding new pops, and the team is growing, and our infrastructure is growing too, which is why we that our partnership with Cycle is a perfect marriage for what we want to offer our customers, and giving them the best choices that we think that are in the world of cloud computing today.
No, no, that's excellent. And so Walt, as obviously with that intro, you are the developer advocate for Vulture, right?
Yeah.
And so as a developer advocate, what does like obviously Vulture, growing company doing a lot of things. What does your job look like on that day to day? What do you is there any
Yeah.
challenges that came along with your job that you weren't expecting? And yeah.
So my challenges right now. Well, so I've been at Vulture for about 5 or 6 weeks now, and so my day to day right now is just getting up on everything of like learning what like the company culture is like, learning what our infrastructure does, learning of how we can maybe improve, or doing like customer outreach. So as the developer advocate at Vulture, I'm basically the liaison between the marketing team and the development team, which is where David which is where David comes in at. And so I guess like my day to day right now is we're doing a lot of like marketing pushes. So we're doing things like we're going to be growing out our like YouTube channel. So things just like this, like with a podcast or video, cast, is that we're just trying to do more like customer outreach and trying to give value adds to either our viewers on YouTube or people who are on our Twitter stream trying to like learn more about what we do. So sometimes it's making ads. Sometimes it's maybe working more with the marketing team of what our messages are. And then sometimes it's with the development team of maybe just trying to like learn more about what our pipeline is and how to best convey that to our future like prospective clients.
No, and that makes complete sense. And so before we continue, I learned recently that you have a pretty deep background in music, and I saw the project that you're working on YouTube. So one, can you shed some light on that? I know it's a bit of a tangent, or sorry, not a tangent, but a deviation from Vulture. But it'd be interesting to share with the users. And then from that, how did you end up getting into tech and working at an infrastructure company?
Yeah, okay. So I have a whole like I joke around is like that my blood is made of like 100% just like social media. So like that's basically like where like I come from. I was like one of the first people to join Twitter. I was on YouTube back in 2005 when I first started. It might have been the beginning of 2006. So I went to school for music. Then I started a YouTube channel because it was like the new thing back in 2006. And I was just like, oh, I think that this whole like internet thing is going to be like a pretty big deal. So I did that for about 8, 9, 10 years, and then it came time to when I decided to like go back and like double down on my coding skills. In 2012, I bought my first Arduino, and then I started just writing C++. Um, and then after, I guess maybe 7, 8 years of doing that, I said, let me just double down and do, like code some of like the pianos and stuff that I've been wanting to do. Just like hard code my music knowledge into, just doing code. So that went pretty well. And then after the pandemic hit, quite a few companies wanted to know. We're trying to connect with people who knew how the internet worked. So that's when the idea of like, oh, maybe I would be a really good like developer advocate because I understand developing and I understand like social media marketing. So it's kind of like that marriage of those two things. And then when Vulture reached out to me, I met the team, and in fact, I met David too, and I was kind of sold. So yeah, that's basically how it happened. So that's like the past 10, 15 years. And then in terms of like what I do, like my orchestra thing, I do have a whole like kind of like music background that's like my like 5 to 9, and then Vulture is like my like like 9 to 5. So I got these like two passions that take up both both times of my days.
No, that's super interesting. I took a look at some of the stuff and I was like, there's a lot happening here. But as we dive back to Vulture, so David, would love to hear about what your day to day is at Vulture, your position, and the things that you're
Sure.
involved in.
Yeah, so I'm the technical lead for cloud native development, and that's kind of a broad term, right? Um, what me and my team kind of maintain is we maintain the entirety of Vulture open source. So everything you see on GitHub, managed load balancers is also another product we maintain. API v2 was something that we spearheaded and also kind of took charge and did that. And recently, the release of the Vulture Kubernetes engine, which is a managed Kubernetes offering. So it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but that's kind of like the scope of what me and my team kind of look at day to day, and the projects kind of shift or priorities kind of shift around depending on what needs attention at that point in time.
So as you said that you work with a lot of the open source tools and things
Yeah,
that Vulture has been building and working with. Um, Obviously, you had mentioned that you're in charge of a lot of the repos, or so your team is responsible for a lot of the repos that end up on Vultr, or sorry, on GitHub.
correct.
And so, can you dive into some of those projects that you open sourced back to the community?
Yeah, so it all started with the Go client. The first thing we did for GitHub was we created a Go client that just wrapped API v1 at the time. And that was, I would say that's the foundation for a lot of our open source tooling, because with that Go client, we were then able to extend it out and implement a Terraform provider, and then also implement a Packer plugin. Um, Also, the Vulture CLI is written in that Go client. So a lot of the tools that you see on our currently on our GitHub page, the backbone of most of them, if not all of them, is the Go client. So that was the first thing we did, and then we also took some other routes where we have a Node client, and the Node client was actually a user or a customer of Vulture that started writing it on their own. Um, and we kind of reached out and said, "Hey, this is a great library. Would you like to kind of give ownership to Vulture, but also continue maintaining it?" And they agreed. So there's a sense of community with our open source where not only do we give a good amount back and we maintain all of these tools and repositories actively, some of them are also products of our customers where they kind of built it, and we recognized the need for it, and we thought, hey, this is really cool. So Vulture Node is one of those repositories where it's an official Vulture product, but it's also maintained by the community, by a third party developer.
And so, as jumping to that Go client for the API.
Mm-hmm.
So back in 2018, when we were integrating with Vulture, we had used the version 1 of the API, and about a month and a half ago, maybe even 2 months ago, we migrated everything over to the version 2 client,
Mm-hmm.
and the new client is so clean. I love it. And actually, we were able to move everything from version 1 to version 2 in about 3.5 hours. And
Pretty
so
quick.
no, no, I mean it was really nice how easy it was to integrate. And so I'd love to hear like as a developer who saw that transition of going from one to two and just literally that. Um, I know like or I kind of get a feeling or a vibe for some of the things that you wanted to implement or you wanted to standardize around.
Mhm.
But as your team being the team to help build that, I'd love to hear like when you and your team sat down to say, hey, we're going to build version 2. What were the main things and like the criteria that you wanted to implement as part of that? Like what was the focus of, or I guess a better way of saying it was, what was the reason you went to a version 2 as opposed to just iterating on a version 1?
So, my a large part of my background before getting into cloud native development was particularly around public API design. So there was always a pet peeve of mine of API v1. API v1 was good. It served the purpose. A lot of people used it, but it was very much a product of its time. It was written, when Vulture was first started, and that's kind of how API design was written at the time. As we all know, technology constantly changes, and the current paradigms, the current standard way of doing things change constantly. So we noticed when we started implementing tools when we wrote that Go client and then we went to go incorporate Terraform, Packer, all these tools, we noticed that the API, while usable, was also not as flexible as we wanted to. If you look at modern APIs, currently there's certain things they all kind of have, whether that be, the URI design is very clear cut. Consistent return types, the structure of the return types being full JSON, and the data that you send being JSON. And there were a lot of things we also wanted to kind of improve upon there. So like URI design, the structure of the requests and the responses, and also to standardize and kind of make everything JSON across the board. So in V1, a lot of the API responses of errors came back as strings. So while that's good if you're writing in loosely typed languages, once you start getting into Go or Java or any language that's strictly typed, you run into the issue where you start to break these structures that you kind of define to interact with these objects. So a lot of the use case for V2 was just usability and extensibility. And you said it yourself with V2, it a lot of developers kind of expect that out of an API these days. So it was quite easy for you to get in there and update everything because it's clear across the board. And also V1 had very good documentation for the API, and that's another trend we wanted to also continue for V2 was make the API as usable, as friendly, and with as much information as there. So even if there is a new product or a new feature, it's very easy to hit the API and kind of see how it behaves and incorporate it at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, and I mean, so much of that makes sense. Like I said, especially as an integrator with your API, there's so
Mm-hmm.
many things that I've seen that I love about the version 2. One of the biggest things is I love that it is more strictly typed, or the data structs that you're getting are
Yeah.
more of what you expect, right? Because like there's, I know in the version 1, there's a couple times where you're getting an integer, but it's always a string, right? And so it's nice that with version 2, you're getting exactly what you'd expect. If it's an int, you're expecting the data type to be an int. And
Right.
so it's been much more reliable to integrate with because we didn't have to, like on our side, we didn't have to do like string to int conversions and back and forth and things like that.
That was one of the not pain points, but something we had to work around with Go. So like when we wrote that Go client, that's when we started to notice a lot of these behaviors that are kind of funky sometimes, where we had to, with the JSON unmarshaller for Go, we had to write custom marshallers and unmarshallers for almost every strut in our Go client because the behavior was so not I want to say inconsistent, but a bit. It was where the behaviors would change here and there. Um, that was a big portion of it too. Another thing that we also kind of streamlined was pagination. So before on V1, there were some calls that would just return all of your data. For example, the instance list call. That was a pretty large call. If you had a lot of instances, you would just kind of get everything thrown at you, and then you, as the integrator or developer, would have to loop through it. And it was just, again, it was usable, but there are ways to make it more extensible and easier to use for, the developer, the integrator like yourself.
Yeah, I mean, makes complete sense. One thing I am curious about, I mean, I agree with the move, but I'm curious of the reasoning behind it. Is when you went from version 1 to version 2, you changed how the IDs are. Instead of it being an auto
Yeah.
incrementing ID, I think you're using what UUID like version 3 or something.
Were you? Yeah. So when we went from API v1 to v2, we actually converted all of the IDs to UUID version 4. Um, the reason, I don't remember the reason for it. I think there was just a bit of a discussion to streamline all of the IDs across the board. In some places we had string IDs, in some places we had the integer based IDs. So we kind of decided, hey, like, what better time than now to streamline all of these IDs into a single format? So it makes things a bit easier, to always know that whatever you're working with, you're going to have that UUID across the board. So I know firewalls, for example, use string-based IDs, with a few characters, while instances were ints. So this was just part of that streamlining decision where we said, hey, like, we have an opportunity now to really improve and streamline everything. So let's also do that with the IDs and just make it a universal UUID version 4 across the board.
Yeah, no, again, one of those things. It makes complete sense. Like I already said, like I'm the version 2 API. I have a lot of good things to say. It was so easy to implement, and it was predictable, right? Like I mean, I think it was
Yes,
the
make it
at the end
boring, right?
yeah, exactly. At the end of the day,
Yeah,
it was predictable. You knew exactly what you were going to get.
yeah.
And so I appreciate the efforts that you've put in for, or that you and your team have put in for that. But as we continue, I know that by the time this podcast goes live, Cycle will have enabled support for Vulture's bare metal, and I know that's something. But we've been working on with a number of people from your team on those efforts. And I know that you have a new server type that you had just added to, sorry, a new server type that you just began to support, and it looks like a really powerful server. Cycle supports it already, but will publicly support it when this goes live. And so I guess kind of bridging bridging those conversations. When I was integrating some of the bare metal stuff to be able to support it. For those who are watching this, and this might be your first encounter with Cycle, one of the big things about Cycle is that whenever a customer deploys a Cycle server, we use Cycle OS, and Cycle OS is just a small operating system built on top of Alpine, that is made specifically for running containers, and that operating system always boots via iPXE. And so, as we were going through this integration process, we realized that there was something that was missing from the version 2 API. That was just the ability to say, hey, not just the first time the server boots, but every time that server reboots ever in the future, we wanted to pull that same iPXE endpoint. And our team had to reach out to your team and get that added. And so I guess I don't know how much we can go into with that capacity, but can you walk through maybe at a high level of what does that look like when there's a new feature request that comes in towards the API, and like how does that communication happen within your team, without getting into anything?
Yeah, sure.
You know.
So, I mean, the way it usually works is, you submitted a request, and it's a valid request. It's a useful request. So, like, right off the bat, we kind of evaluate, like, this is actually a really cool feature. And not only you have a use case for it, chances are there's probably plenty of other people who would also be like, this is awesome. Let's, so that kind of gets us excited, because now we can kind of look at how can we expand and make bare metal better, more usable, more just give it more options to make it a really standout product. So when a request like that comes in, specifically around bare metal, there's a fantastic bare metal team that works around integrating, adding more features, expanding it. So the request usually comes into that specific team, whoever owns that product, and they start the integration process, building it out, making sure it works, all that fun stuff. And then we start collaborating cross teams. So, the bare metal team reaches out to my team. We look at the API. We look at what's the best way to design the API. What's the URI structure going to look like? What's the response request? And then we kind of just, meld the two together, where the products are usually a bit dark deployed, or they're there, and we just kind of have to flip the switch and integrate the API to that functionality across teams. So with this request, that's exactly how it worked, where, your request came in and it was brought to the bare metal team's attention. It was brought to my attention that, hey, we're going to have to support this at some point. And that's, we try to do some preliminary work ahead of time, looking at like, okay, what's the behavior? What's the structure going to look like? Well, try, like you said, make it predictable, make it boring in a way that if we do release this endpoint, you can look at it and kind of have an idea, all right, that makes total sense, and you expect it to behave the way it does. So that's usually how the request process works for new features. Is it goes to the appropriate team, and then my team handles the API integration and collabs with them.
So, with kind of on right in line with the feature request component, this is something that is always very difficult because so before I started Cycle years ago, I was working for an infrastructure provider called SingleHop, which has since been acquired and things like that. But I was on their API team. And one of the things that was always really interesting was compatibility breaking changes or deprecation of calls. And
Yeah.
is that something that you've had to deal with yet? Within either version 1 or version 2, and what was kind of the if you did have to go through that process, was there anything that like yeah, I mean,
It's a great question, right? So it's always on my mind, and I try to avoid any type of breaking changes for any API, because the downstream impact could be next to nothing, or it could be actually catastrophic. Because it's hard to know how many use. We have an idea, but it's hard to tell, if we make this one change, how bad would it be for someone that we're not aware of how they're integrating with it. So we always take a lot of these request changes and try to really examine them. Like something like this, it's new behavior, it's not a problem. But if we're looking at new behavior or trying to expand the behavior, my first priority, my first thought is like, can we introduce this without breaking it for anyone? Because that's it. We all know how certain APIs in the past, not naming names, have just completely changed the API, and it's good luck. So luckily enough, we haven't had an issue where we've had to introduce a breaking change to version 2. We've been able to work around them by enhancing certain responses and certain requests to either add a new field, or have an existing field there deprecated, but start nudging people to say, hey, like there's this new field, you should probably start using this one in the meantime. At some point, we haven't done it yet, but we have introduced new fields and kind of nudged people to use a new behavior, without removing the old one yet, because we can't just go ahead and remove it. But luckily, we haven't had any breaking changes, and I hope it stays that way, because that's a big concern for API development. How do we prevent causing headaches for people?
yeah, I mean that, especially I mean I think it's a problem that both of our companies have. Is I mean we have a lot of companies that are super integrated with Cycle's API, and the nice thing about Cycle's API is that when a company's integrating with us, they can say, hey, I want I want a new container deployed, and they can say, hey, I want this to be just deployed on Vulture. And if they have stuff running at 3 or 4 of your locations or whatever, or some of it's bare metal and some of it's virtual machines, of course they can get really specific and say, hey, I only want this deployed to this location on this type of server, or even just target a specific server. But it's really neat because at the same time, these companies can say, hey, here's this container, just run it over at Vulture, and then Cycle can choose where it needs to live and things like that. But it's really interesting because I mean, just along the same lines with that incompatibility issue, there's so many times where it's like you get feature requests and it's like, like that could be a good feature, but you have to
Right.
almost say no because like, well, we don't want to make the API too complex. We don't want to introduce so much functionality. I like how you said earlier of keep it boring, right? Like it should be predictable,
Yeah.
should be boring. I think that's a great way a great way of looking at it. But so as you mentioned that you're a lead developer. At Vulture. Can you give us any hints of, you or Walt, give us any hints of some things that are coming down the pipeline for new things we should be expecting?
We definitely have a bunch in our pipeline. Some of it may be a little too early to kind of hint at or announce, but there's definitely exciting things in the pipeline that would further how you could use Vulture, right? We're always looking to, our core audience are developers, companies who want to integrate. They need a platform. So we definitely keep an eye out and an open mind for how can we improve this whole experience and how can we, offer more to the developer and really give them a platform that they can trust and use.
Yeah, and so there are two things that I can maybe like allude to. One is, well, I'll just start. So first of all, we have more locations that we're going to be adding in the future. I can't name any names yet, but we're always just trying to maybe just like do more like expansion. So, just look for that in the future. And also, we have a new bare metal SKU. So we have a new $185 per month plan. And as you had talked about before about like the benefits of like bare metal, it's great because that there's no like virtualization. It's just the raw physical machine. And then there's like no overhead from, like any other, like tenants or, like just like there's just like no other like noise there. So I guess like those are like the two things is the bare metal SKU, and we're always, looking into adding more SKUs in the future, and then like any like future like pop locations. So more on that in the future, but nothing to announce here.
So with the amount of locations that Vulture has, which is something that like we have a couple of companies that are using Cycle, and then they're working towards the idea of being able to almost use like all of Vulture's locations to almost build their own edge service. So it's neat. Like they'll have this one container. They'll say, "Hey, Cycle, distribute this to every single location that Vulture supports." And so it's neat to be able to have that many locations where people can or these companies can start to build almost edge like I don't even know what you'd call it, like an edge, like almost like a CDN, but like actually that's still a term that is still confused me. Like, what's the difference between edge and CDN, other than the fact that I think one is like includes compute and the other is purely just like distribution of files. But maybe you guys can help me answer that question, because to me, I mean, I think it's roughly the same thing, or maybe it's just a
More or
different
less,
concept.
I'd say. I
Yeah.
would say more or less, but no, you have a good point. Like it's interesting to see how your platform does the same thing that kind of my goals for the APR is you offer a very consistent way of doing containers without having to worry about infrastructure, which I think is super interesting. And to kind of further that point, with our locations and then your super easy use of just distributing containers across all the locations, it can really lead to some interesting products or interesting developments. Like you said, like people could build these edge CDN, whatever we want to call it, services with ease of use without having to worry about a ton of underlying infrastructure, right? Because a lot of that Cycle manages, which I think is really interesting, especially in the container space.
Absolutely. I just the opportunities that our companies together, the opportunities that our companies together provide other companies and other developers,
Right.
is really exciting. And so as I talk about this Edge and CDN, as I talk about Edge and CDN, one question I have, and this is like I probably should know the answer to this, and I could probably find it in a matter of like 20 seconds. But remind me if the private network. So I know that there's private network functionality that Vulture has added within the portal. And do those private networks currently extend across data centers, or is that only region specific at the current time? or is that like I know that's a question that just kind of dropped out there, but as I'm thinking about CDN, it's like, is that something?
Currently the private networks are region specific. So if you create a private network the New Jersey data center, it will exist in the New Jersey data center. As it currently, the private networks currently are region specific.
Got it. And I know that's pretty normal.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of had a brain fart and it's like I forget about that. But anyway, yeah, I mean I believe that that's pretty standard. But so as we go back to talk about those locations, Vulture obviously has presence around the world, and so as with Cycle, obviously we're still a growing company. We have a number of clients, but almost 90 to 95% of our clients are in the U.S. I'm guessing that with Vulture, your clients are much more distributed around the world. Is there any insights you can provide as to kind of what that looks like? And I guess as a follow up to that question, with the support teams that the Vulture has, like, do you often encounter issues with language barriers and things like that, or is your support team kind of distributed well enough as well that you can handle all of those needs?
I can speak on. So our website is actually localized in, I think it's six different languages. In terms of the support team, I don't know the answer to that of like if we have different support, I guess like different like support languages. And then your previous question was it was about what was it? What it was the you
It was
had
like
a question before that.
Yeah, it was like the makeup of your customers, right? Like
Oh, that's
we're
what it was.
like
That's
ninety
what it was.
percent of ours are
What's
from the
the
U.S.
division like around the world in terms of like, are we just like a like USA brand? Well, not brand, but in terms of like, are our customers mainly coming, through, like which like domestic place? I don't have those numbers for you, but yeah, I'm not sure if David has those.
I don't know off the top of my head, but just if I take a kind of like a quick glance at like look at our load balancer product, that's a product that anybody anywhere will use, and I would say it's pretty. You see an even distribution. Obviously, there are going to be some places that might have a bit more, but there's no one region that outpaces another. I'd say that I'm just giving you something that I look at would be load balancers. So people around the world in all of our regions are using like that specific product. And if they have a load balancer, they have instances as well. So I don't have specific numbers, but I would say it's I've seen high usage across the board in every region, which is kind of why we're excited to constantly expand, because there is a demand around the globe for compute and these services.
No, that's good to hear. And so with talking about the load balancer and things, so I've never played around with Vulture's load balancer. Cycle implements its own. That way, like Cycle's whole goal is to own the stack as much as we can. So our goal is like to consume compute and then bring every other or have every other service just kind of built in, right? Because that way,
Mm-hmm.
as Cycle is multi-cloud, if someone is using Vulture plus another provider, we don't want to have to say, hey, we support this load balancer but not this load balancer and things like that. So we
Mm-hmm.
actually have a load balancer container packaged in the Cycle that will run alongside our customer stuff. But for anyone checking out this podcast that might be wondering, like, or might be curious about running things directly on Vulture and consuming your load balancer service, can you dive into how that works and what use cases you've seen people use it for?
Yeah, so the load balancer, it's a highly available load balancer. So we do have multiple failovers available to the user. So the use case for load balancers, right? People are It's hard to say exactly what they're building it, but we do see a lot of people using it for scaling out, building highly resilient, highly available services behind them. That's usually, I would say, most of the time what we see. We see some APIs kind of sitting behind it. Um, but the makeup of the load balancer, like I said, we do have multiple failovers. That way, users using load balancers can safely know that if there ever is a failure within that load balancer cluster, there are multiple failovers. So that gives us the time to kind of resolve or replace any of those nodes in that cluster to make sure that you always have that uptime that you need. So I would say, back to your original question, how do people use it? Mostly for keeping the uptime of their critical path services, APIs, websites constantly up with multiple instances behind the load balancer.
Got it. And so I know this is maybe a slight technical dive, but with the load balancer offering, if someone were to have so again, this is me not using me. I have no experience with the specific load
Mm-hmm.
balancer product. But if I, as a user, want to deploy the load balance, or if I was using that load balancer product, would I, as you mentioned, it was AJ, so there's multiple instances. Can I, as a user, see those multiple instances, or do I literally just see, hey, this is a load balancer service, and here's what it's going to do?
Yeah, so the load balancer offering that Vulture has is completely managed. We manage the entire cluster. All you see is you deploy a load balancer, and that's all you see. You see um, the entry point, the Ingress API, and then you have the ability to modify a few things such as proxy protocol, define which instances you want to be balanced. There's private networking support between the load balancer and the attached instances if you want that. And there's also 2 layers of firewalls that users can also have, where you can define firewall rule sets on the load balancer cluster itself. And then you can also define a firewall or load balancer firewall on your set instances on the back. So you could have, let's say you have multiple 2 instances of your site, but you only ever want them to accept traffic from your load balancer. You can define a firewall rule on those instances that say only accept traffic from said load balancer, and then you can define your rule set of firewalls on the load balancer. As for protocols, you can define HTTP, HTTPS, and TCP forwarding rules. And that's basically it. You have flexibility to configure the load balancer as you want, but you don't manage it. We fully take care of it. All you see is a load balancer product, but we fully maintain it, so you don't have to.
And is the load balancer region specific, or can I load balance to applications or to instances outside of the same region as the load balancer?
It's region specific, so the load balancer has to exist in the same region as your set instances.
Got it. Got it. That makes sense. And so, as we bring everything full circle, we had asked, we put out a couple tweets and messages to our community before the podcast for any questions people might have, and we did get 2 questions from our community that would probably be good to dive into. The first one was, the first one was, does Vulture ever expect to support GPUs?
I don't know if it's on. I don't know if it's on the roadmap or if there's anything moving. I'm not sure if Walt has anything to share on that. But like I said before, when you asked if there's any type of hints or any kind of teasers we can give you, while I'm not sure about that specific thing, I wouldn't. We're always looking to evolve and we're always looking to expand. So it could very well be that it's something on the cards, but I don't know exactly or for 100% if GPUs is in the works.
Got it.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question either. So, it's out of my reign.
No worries. And the second question we got was someone who had said, I don't see CycleS as an option on Vulture. How do I test cycle? And that's obviously more of a question for myself. But for anyone who is already using Vulture and has experience with Vulture but wants to be able to use Cycle, so Cycle the way to use Cycle on Vulture is a bit differently than if you wanted to use like CentOS or another operating system, where with those you can deploy an instance, select the OS, etc. Right? With Cycle, because as I mentioned earlier that it's the iPixie approach, the idea with Cycle is that you create an account at Cycle, you put in your Vulture API key, and then we will deploy that infrastructure into your Vulture account for you. But when you go ahead and actually deploy those servers over at Vulture, we are going to attach an iPixie endpoint behind the scenes. So it's still your infrastructure, your data, it's still your Vulture account. You still own the infrastructure, but behind the scenes, Cycle is supplying that iPixie endpoint to make sure that those servers boot up. And so that's that. But no, I want to thank both of you for taking the time to be on the podcast today, and it was excellent to be able to dive into these different questions and to hear to introduce more of our community towards the team over at Vulture, and it was a great time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks for
thanks for
having
having
us.
us.